right? Joe Biden. We can talk about the State of the Union. So we'll
Sure.
bring it right into the question you had.
Absolutely.
You celebrate the American Rescue Plan. The American Rescue Plan was wonderful, great legislation. But think about this. First of all, the child tax credit was for 1 year. That's over. Okay.
It's just reminding people that, oh yeah, this cool thing we did last year, well, you don't have it anymore.
Right. And let's go back to a year, in fact, to the question of the $15 an hour minimum wage. And let's not forget, it was not the Republicans obstructing its passage. It was 8 Democratic senators, or at least 6 who did, including a man that Biden himself cited or named in the course of his State of the Union address, Chris Coons, the senator from Delaware, whom Biden himself mentored in politics. And Biden then went on to talk about the imperative of passing a $15 minimum wage. Well, where the hell was he a year ago? Why didn't he call Coons and the other guys in and say, and women, and say, make my internet connection is unstable. Can you still hear me?
It's good. You're good?
Okay. I don't know why that happened, but it came up. But the point is, that was so telling and tragic that we didn't see that. And of course, we can also remind ourselves the year has gone by, and has Biden absolved people of $10,000 of their student debt? I mean, even Schumer wanted to see a $50,000, wanted to see that, forgiven. So I mean, this is
at least he said publicly that he would like that to happen. We all know that behind the scenes, and as you're laying out, they don't really care. Like, they use these things as like political cudgels without doing any of the work, and then they just kind of forget about it.
Yeah, well, if we look close, I'm not convinced that Schumer didn't want to see it actually happen, because I think he imagined that it would be a tremendous economic boost. And Schumer has always been recognized as the defender of hedge funds. Okay, not specifically the defender of banks, but the defender of hedge funds. So you might have imagined you'll liberate all those folks from that kind of debt, and they'll start spending money in ways that they hadn't done so
That's
before.
true.
And who knows? Okay, I mean, but the point is, the Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate over and over again has failed to push Biden himself. I mean, call him out. Okay, FDR, to go back to one of my presidential figures, FDR regularly called on Americans to push him. Over and over again. In 1935, FDR, when it looked like the Supreme Court was going to undo some of the major things that they had enacted earlier, and they did, in fact, he actually told Americans, look, new laws in themselves do not bring the millennium. You're still going to have to struggle. And he sent his cabinet out around the country to promote social movements, to bring pressure to bear. I mean, there's lots of stories like that. And we've just not seen that from Biden. So let's talk about the State of the Union. I mean, the biggest failing to my mind, I got from the left, people attacked me because I think probably because I said he hit the right notes. However, the notes just hung there in the air. And what I also said is, but ultimately he said nothing. And of course, then I got the liberals to attack me
right,
for having said that. And what I meant by that is, if you're going to offer a truly progressive, I mean, let's face it, we're never going to get radicalism out of Biden, but let's imagine a small p progressivism that he seemed to promise. That I celebrated the fact Bernie was the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, because that meant that he would be able to set an agenda and keep Biden somewhat honest, right? And they proposed many a thing, which it's called Build Back Better, right?
Yeah, we'll see if it ever happens.
Right now, I wouldn't bet on it. I'm sure you wouldn't either. But it's the case that if it really was going to be a speech to rev up the Democratic American people, that what he needed to say is, how about this? So when he got to work, he made reference to the importance of passing the PRO Act. One sentence, pass the PRO Act. But if he really meant that, here's what he should have done. Do you also remember who he brought on and was sitting in the gallery? The CEO of Intel? Mm-hmm. The billionaire head of Intel, right? Because he was going to invest, $20 billion in Eastern Ohio. Although let me come back to that in a moment. If Biden was serious about passing the PRO Act, he would have invited some of the Starbucks workers who are organizing to try to get recognition for their union. He would have put them in the gallery. Or perhaps he would have brought Chris Smalls, the Amazon, well, former Amazon worker, whether he's with them now or not, I don't remember. The point is that who was trying to organize,
Yeah,
and is
I
still
mean,
pursuing.
and it's real quick. It's not like Joe Biden doesn't know what's going on. I mean, last year he was in support of the Bessemer, Alabama union effort.
We had little evidence he was in support.
Well, he talked about it at least.
Yeah, exactly.
So he knows that this movement is there, and he chose to just ignore them.
Well, and the trick is that if he had brought Chris Smalls on, or he had brought some Starbucks workers on, or or a year ago we brought somebody from Bessemer on, or maybe a mine workers leader from Alabama, if he brought them on and had them in the gallery, that would have been a signal to workers to organize all the more energetically and to make demands all the more, like the Kellogg's workers who had a union, but basically they didn't have decency in the workplace. Okay. The idea is that's the kind of thing that we should have seen him doing. That's on that question. I mean, when he got to the question of women's rights and the right to choose, maybe he would have said, he might have dropped in, maybe it's time for a new women's march. Just drop in the line, right? I mean, there are things that he could have done which would have required another sentence that would have inspired or encouraged perhaps the kind of action from below, which, by the way, it doesn't mean things would have happened. The Supreme Court is still going to devastate the rights of Americans. I mean, it's set up that way. The Congress is still going to have to deal with the likes of Manchin, the Democrats, and Sinema, and Chris Coons. But here's the key thing. Over the horizon is November 2022. And though the Republicans may not be able to win all the seats that they aspire to take back from the Democrats, let Americans know that their energies matter and that the Democratic Party is allied with the struggles. And then they'll see a turnout, because the biggest problem in a midterm election is not that the Republicans will gain votes. It's that the folks who voted for the Democrats before just won't turn out. So imagine 18 to 30-year-olds who still have massive student debt. Are they excited by what they've seen the Democratic Party do? They generally don't turn out in midterms as they would in a presidential year. Give them reason. Joe, just pick up the pen. Think how exciting it would have been if that night he had held up a pen up there on the podium and said,
and just signed the executive orders.
Yep, here's the pen I'm going to use to absolve $50,000 of student debt for every student indebted, or all of it, whatever it might have been. You can imagine all across the country. The next day, people would have been, well, I'm exaggerating, dancing in the streets, but you got the idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing about the State of the Union is that, like, he not only in a lot of ways just ignored or pretended like left movements don't exist, but I mean, one of the big moments was that he was trashing on the defund the police movement. Like, even if you disagree with the movement to defund the police or reform the police, just like the point of the president openly trashing it is just unnecessary, right? Like, it's just, to me, it just feels like punching down for the sake of it. And we've been seeing this a lot with a lot of this propaganda coming out of the centrist Democratic wing, talking about how the squad is destroying the party when their policies aren't even being passed, right? So, like, we're seeing this, like, backlash against, like, people just saying, hey, we would like this, not even like really pushing for it. Like, the squad isn't really capable of pushing for this in Congress too much. They're still too, like, they're not powerful enough in size. And, you know, we saw some good results in the primaries in Texas the other day, so maybe they will have more members of the squad coming soon. But, you know, it seems that the centrist wing, the neoliberal wing, is really, like, they're trying to, like, stamp out a lot of the more radical parts of the, like, whether or not you want to consider them parts of the Democratic Party or just radical movements that are, you know, existing in tandem with the Democratic Party. It seems like they're trying to, like, push back against that a little bit as well.
Yeah, look, I thought it was unfortunate that the call went out as defund the police. I wanted to hear demilitarize the police, okay, or reform the police, whatever it might have been. And by the way, the squad, I've not heard them in Congress call for defunding the police. So that, you know, that it's outrageous the way in which Biden literally bought into the Republican propaganda. So or centrist Democrat propaganda for that matter. But what was really amazing is that he couldn't figure out a way to articulate. This is always the thing that gets to me. He couldn't figure out a way to articulate both the aspirations of the Black Lives Movement alongside of the imperative of gun control. Right? I mean, that was amazing. I mean, yeah, he dropped the line about gun control and all that, but the fact is that whoever is writing his speeches or encouraging him to say certain kinds of things, they're our greatest obstacle probably to. By the way, that's a good point you made. I want to add another point, which I thought was punching down. Why does Biden constantly feel the need to say that bullshit line, I'm a capitalist? I mean, that's like, it's like, how many times does he have to slap Bernie, you might say? Okay. That's utterly, sorry, can I use the F word?
Go for it.
It's fucking ridiculous when he does that. It's for a start, it's fucking ridiculous because as much money as he may make in certain kinds of investments, he's been a goddamn public servant all of his career. He's not been the head of a company. He's not been a corporate boss. Okay. So that's just outrageous. But again, he showed his alliance. As I said, he brought the CEO of Intel on to sit in the gallery. He didn't bring any labor figures on. He could at least have brought a labor leader like my friend Sarah Nelson, the head of the airline flight attendants, to be there, which would, assuming she would have said yes to being there, but she might have wanted to know what he was going to say before she did. But so let's put it this way. I tweeted it, I think, in some, he said the right things, but he said nothing at all. Ultimately, there was no narrative to bind together all of these throwaway lines.
Yeah, like it was just kind of like participating in like the Republican-led culture war, but like from his perspective, right? Like he didn't try to like move the needle on the culture war at all. He just kind of like, yeah, the Republicans say that we wanted to fund the police. Well, I gave them 3 times the funding. So look at me. And then it's like, well, okay, well, you just bought into the whole framing of Republicans and you're just like wasting your time with their propaganda war. And he really gave very little to like anyone. And we can make the argument that Joe Biden's not talking to us. He's talking to, the group of swing voters and their imaginations, like that are going to swing to Democrats again or something. I don't know. It just seems it's so haphazard to me what coalition they're even trying to build here.
Yeah. In his favor, I want to say he didn't use the line, the soul of America.
Oof. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
That's like that. I knew we were in trouble when John Meacham became his primary historical advisor, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. But the fact is, just think if he had done the kinds of things that a Lincoln or FDR was capable of doing, of talking about the meaning of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And FDR said, look, life means you have to have a job and an income capable of supporting life. First of all, liberty means you have to be enabled to exercise those rights. He always took it back to the need for economic security and enabling liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Well, if he's going to talk about the $15 an hour minimum wage, if he's going to talk about all of these things, he might have said, the American promise, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness requires these things. But I'm convinced that in many ways you're right. He was basically, but even if he had used life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he would have been able to speak to the suburban, soccer moms and Republican voter. And by the way, most of those folks despise a good part of what the Republican Party is. So the trick is to remind them of who they are and why they need to vote for Democrats, even if they're not the most progressive Democrats. You want to fill the seats. In the meantime, you and I, of course, want to see progressives unseat centrist Democrats in the primaries. My biggest hope right now is that Nina Turner can win in Cleveland. And I've been, in constant contact with Nina, encouraging her, and she's been encouraging me on what you heard the other day at the Progressive Democrats of America Town Hall, the pursuit of an economic bill of rights for all Americans.
Yeah, like that's another thing as well, is that like you were saying with FDR, it's like a feedback loop where like FDR would push the movements to push him, and then it would go further and further in that realm. But with Biden, we're seeing, like we can talk about Bernie in a second too, because he's like the kind of de facto progressive leader as well. But Biden's like pushing back at all times. And then like Bernie, I think Bernie is doing a good job, but I wish he would do better in trying to like channel these movements and bring like a bigger coalition. Like we need a way to like try to bring the power of like the Black Lives Matter movement with the labor movement, and like, you know, like the modern day civil rights movement with like, especially with gay and trans rights and stuff after what's going on in Texas. We need to find the bridges with all these movements so that we can unify our power. And I wish that Bernie would do that a little bit more explicitly, but also he's, you know, old. And that's what I feel like about Nina Turner, is that every time like she speaks, she does a really good job of like bringing those kinds of movements together, the diverse like group of like, you know, struggles, but like all for like the common, like we got to unify under this, because as long as we're set, like, you know, like in these separate groups fighting for these things, and like these things are good and we need to fight for them, without the unified power, we're just kind of, you know, we're all fighting against each other in that sense.
Right. Well, in the 1930s, the broad movements of the left came together in what was called the Popular Front. And we need something like that. And in this book that of my essays and speeches of the last, well, now 12 years, I actually say what we desperately need if we're going to make history is a broad coalition of the left, a united front. And by the way, there's no reason why we couldn't use life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the slogan of that struggle. I like the pursuit of the Economic Bill of Rights, but here's a thought. My ambition, and I think it's that of my co-author on this, Alan Minsky, the executive director of Progressive Democrats, is to try to get at least a coalition of, say, progressive Democrats, of labor unions, of Our Revolution, the organization Bernie launched that Nina Turner was so actively involved in. To get these kinds of folks together, the Poor People's Movement that Reverend Barber's heading up right now, to at least subscribe to this idea of an Economic Bill of Rights for all Americans, okay, as a start. And beyond that, we could literally say, look, as FDR understood, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not what the right-wingers like Newt Gingrich or, you know, I don't want to go through the whole litany of names.
Yeah, like they have these distorted definitions of these words that like aren't real.
Yeah, they've hijacked it, absolutely hijacked the terms. And our trick is to lay claim, as I say, take hold of our history, let it inspire us not to necessarily try to live the past or to try to, for that, look, when I heard people say we're looking forward to returning to normal, well, screw returning to normal. Normal was 45 years of class war on working people and the rights, the democratic rights that were achieved in the 60s and the 70s. Our trick is not to go back to normal. Our trick is our ambition or our aspiration is to literally reclaim the vision of those movements. You know, there was a writer around 1900, he died early 20th century, named Henry Demarest Lloyd. And I'm never quite sure if this was his argument or the argument of another figure in the late 19th century, Wendell Phillips, who was an abolitionist, a labor advocate, a women's rights advocate. And here's the line. It's, people think that to protect liberty, we have to be vigilant, and that's true. But as Henry Demarest Lloyd put it, the defense of liberty requires more than vigilance. It means that we have to defend the rights that our ancestors accorded us and afforded us by providing new rights for our children. You cannot defend by standing still.
You got to keep the ball rolling?
You've got to keep the ball rolling. I mean, if America truly is, or was at least, a grand experiment in democracy, every experimental method demands you test new things. You look for ways to move ahead. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to be the grand experiment, sure as hell, we've got to not just defend the rights of the past, we have to build upon those rights and afford new rights in line with this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.